You're listening to Subsound Radio. We bring you streaming and live broadcasting from the capital. This is the Arpa podcast. Welcome to the latest episode of the Arpa podcast. Joining me in studio, of course, is Maria. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
So, happy Carnival, happy Ash Wednesday, happy Lent. Are you giving anything up for this 6-week penitent period?
No, I'm actually taking things on.
You're taking things on. What have you taken on?
I don't know, more sweet.
I can agree with that. Okay, so today we're going to talk about a book that we've been discussing before. But in part one of the show, we're going to talk generally about the different news items that we've been looking at over the last while. Has anything caught your attention in the media over the last few weeks?
I don't know, I'm scared to say.
Well, yes, in Spain it's difficult to say certain things because of gag laws and eager police force. Have you learned anything else that's non-controversial or at least less controversial?
Not in national news. Not international news.
Not international news. Okay. Well, regarding the Spain situation, all I will say is puppets. So Google Spain and puppets, and then you can fill in the rest of the pictures yourself. Well, I mean, this is the centenary year in Ireland of the 1916 rebellion. So it's 2016. It happened 100 years ago. I mentioned to you yesterday, didn't I, that there's a book out detailing how some Indian people who found themselves in Dublin training as doctors over the fateful weekend of Easter weekend when it all kicked off. And they pitched in and helped with the Irish Republicans, you know. So it's a little known fact of Irish history that there were Indians fighting with the Irish nationalists, you know. And in other news as well, the last synagogue in Ireland closed down, and that's also linked to the Irish Revolutionary War in 1916, because Jewish people played a huge part in that as well, relatively speaking. And now the Jewish community in Ireland, unfortunately, has dwindled to quite a low number, to it probably being very non-existent, and the last synagogue in Ireland closing down is representative of that fact. So that happened last week as well. So this being the start of the Easter period, and this being the centenary year of the Easter Rising, Easter Sunday and Easter Monday, when that comes up, we'll be discussing more Irish republicanism. So a thing that's very close to my heart.
Who would have thought?
Nobody. Well, we've stayed away from that subject on the podcast so far.
Yeah, so
I'm coming back with a vengeance, talking about Irish nationalism. So anything else to add before part 2 of the show?
Before part 2?
Yeah, I mean, when we do the whole, actual show. This is just a preamble.
No, let's go for it.
Okay, well, enjoy this wonderful musical interlude, and we'll be back with part 2. Welcome back to part 2 of the show. I'm going to hand this microphone over to the very capable hands of Maria, because you're going to be
interviewing you about the book you've been reading.
Exactly, which is called Once Upon a Time in Russia by Ben Mezrich. You mightn't have heard of him before, but he's the guy who wrote the book that the film The Social Network was based upon. So he has form in this area of writing books about real events and relatively recent events as well. So I don't know. In the form of a Russian KGB agent, may the questioning begin.
Okay, complete the following sentence. Once upon a time in Russia.
A lot of corruption happens.
Okay, well, that's not only Russia, is it?
No.
No,
This
no.
is a particular brand of corruption. Well, it really looks at in detail is the rise of the oligarchs, people that we're familiar with, like Roman Abramovich, who's the owner of Chelsea Football Club, and other super wealthy people who've amassed huge fortunes, very often in legal and not so legal ways, and also the rise of Vladimir Putin, the man who facilitated this as well to an extent, but also as well who put a curb on it in the sense of that he let them keep their millions, but he had to keep his political power. And it's a story that zeroes in on three main protagonists, and then it discusses the Russian situation in general.
Okay, very interesting. So, who would you say is the most important character in the book?
Well, they're all important. I mean, obviously Putin is the antagonist, and even though he doesn't feature so much word count wise across the pages, he's definitely a shadow that hangs over the other characters in the book. So I think Litvinenko, who we know as the man who was murdered by I mean, we haven't discovered by who yet, but more.
You almost gave it away there.
Well, exactly. Well, no, it's not a spoiler in the book, but it's something that's happening right now in
Yeah.
British courts, and so he's one of the main characters, and also his business guy who he had a professional relationship with. He was protecting him, Berezkov, who fell foul of Putin. So these guys are the protagonists of the book. They push the story forward, I suppose, and the author follows them closely. And even when Putin is mentioned, it's usually in the sense of how they feel about him or the actions they've taken to work against him, maybe.
Okay, how is football related to all this?
Football's not related, but Abramovich is a guy who was a protege of Berezkov because he was a young, bright thing who made a lot of money and was clearly very capable. Berezkov was very pig-headed, I suppose. He was very combative, and he had a lot of clashes with Putin. Putin gave him some opportunities to fall into line. Abramovich knew which way the wind was blowing, politically speaking, and basically fell in behind Putin and distanced himself from Berezkov. So Abramovich doesn't feature very largely in the book, but you do get the sense that he came up through the same means as the characters that we are looking at, and he played ball with the government, and that's why he hasn't been arrested or murdered even. So it is a very high stakes situation that these guys were involved in.
So perhaps he features in the book as a sort of like example for that Western people might understand somehow.
No, I mean It's not like a plot device or anything. I mean, he's just there as a guy who was involved with the characters that the author is looking at.
Well, speaking of plot device, I think you mentioned a very interesting, literary device that the book used.
Well, I mean, the book is interesting, but other reviewers have zoned in on this as well, and I tend to agree with their criticism of it because it is something that's overwhelmingly negative in a sense because he writes it in the style of a political thriller, as if the story was fictitious, but reality is often stranger than fiction, more dramatic, more corrupt, more venal than fiction, and that's certainly the case in the rise of the oligarchs and the communist Russian regime in society. So I think if he had left it as it was and portrayed these characters more in the sense of this is a historical document or historical book, it would have been more gratifying because it would have had more of an impact. I think by writing it in a literary way, the author is trying to add suspense and drama, but I think it's actually a barrier between us and what actually happened, because if you know obviously you know what happened because you're reading it and you know it's a true account, but if it's reported in a more direct style, I think it would have more of an impact. Also as well, there's moments where he colours in the thoughts or feelings of the characters. Or the protagonists, like Litvinenko, when he was poisoned, he supposes how he's feeling, and again, it's fair enough, I suppose. I mean, he's a writer, he studied it, so I think he probably can make an educated guess. But at the same time, nobody really knows what's going on in somebody's internal world, and I think it's probably maybe not misleading, but it's not helpful to the overall structure or point of the book. to employ this kind of style. So while it's different, and that's always worthy for something, it's not a style that I would rush to read again. You know, I prefer having my fiction as fiction, and my historical fact reported as historical fact.
Okay, that's a useful reflection. So, how is it different? You know, the Putin era, basically. How is it different from, for example, the Yeltsin period, or you know, does it change, or is it something that is already brewing at the time of Yeltsin's government?
Well, there is an overlap, and it's not so black and white, but generally, the rise of Berezkov was during the Yeltsin era, where he managed to keep him afloat and keep him in power and bankroll his campaign because he was good for business, basically, because the other main candidate before Yeltsin was a communist, and Berezkov as well saw if he could put someone into power that he'd be well looked after and he would be able to expand his business and take advantage of that fact. And Putin came on the scene because Yeltsin was very sick. He was very old and he had a lot of heart failures and he was on his last legs. You know, for a long time, and it was actually Berezkov's and Yeltsin's idea to install Putin, and they did it very cleverly by by Yeltsin retiring 6 months before the election and putting Putin, who was the prime minister at the time, to kind of take over on a temporary basis, which would give him a 6-month head start over their main political rival, who at the time was a lot more popular and had a lot more support in Moscow and in other parts as well. And then, of course, Putin won the presidency of Russia, and that's where the story kind of begins its second part. Now, what was the main difference between it? Well, Putin was wary of these oligarchs who thought they could buy and sell politics. It wasn't as if that Putin was above corruption himself, but it's just he felt that he wanted to control it in his own way. And so he arrested other oligarchs. He invited a lot of them to a meeting in Stalin's former summer house in a very sinister show of power, and he made it known that they could keep their millions and keep making their money, but that basically that politics was his domain and they'd have to stay out of it. And he backed up that with action, because Berezkov stepped over that and attacked, because he owned a lot of newspapers, and attacked Putin in the media over things like the Kursk disaster and other personal attacks. And Putin obviously took exception to that, because in Russia especially you can't be seen as a weak leader. And Putin, you know, a lot of his cachet amongst voters was that he was tough and no nonsense, and he knew how to get things done. And Berezkov was kind of threatening that. So in that sense, there's a clearer delineation between business and politics, but you know, still corrupt. And Putin was still using the arms of government for his own ends, which is why Litvenko ended up in the United Kingdom in exile as well, like Berezkov did. Berezkov fell afoul of him politically and in a business way as well. Litvenko was ordered to kill Berezkov by the leader of the FSB. He refused to do that, and you know, there was a huge trial where Litvenko was put on trial for basically going against the Secret Service. He was cleared of all wrongdoing, of course, because he didn't do anything wrong. He was whistleblowing effectively, and Putin tried to arrest him again. You know, so this, I mean, it's, in many ways the same forces were still in play, but Putin was trying to assert his right to use kind of those dark arts and take it away from people who are businessmen.
Okay, that seems like quite a comprehensive account of events for the past I don't know how many years in Russia. Probably about.
I mean, the best thing about the book is that it's so recent. I mean, as we discussed at the start of the podcast, that they're doing the Litvenko trial at the moment. There's a lot of pressure in Britain not to prosecute these guys from British ambassadors abroad. It's a very critical moment where the West is cooperating a lot with Russia over issues such as Syria and how to respond to threats such as ISIS. And then Putin as well. Obviously, last year he was involved in Ukraine, still is, in South Ossetia and Georgia as well. And there's other things that he's doing right now which are not democratically friendly or clean, shall we say. So it's a story that begins with the fall of communism, you know, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and is continuing today. It's a story that's still unfolding. So if you really like the book and you want to read more, just turn on your TV station and watch the news or open the newspapers, because the same characters are involved. Well, Berezkov is dead and so is Litvenko, but the Litvenko trial keeps his memory alive, and Putin, of course, is making headlines for all sorts of different reasons, and that will continue, I'm sure.
Oh, that's fascinating. And would you give it a rating?
I would give it a 6 or no, I give it a 7 out of 10. I mean, I did learn a lot from reading it. But as I said, the style is a little bit off-putting, and some chapters are like maybe a page or 2 pages long, which is fine if it's a book because you can see that in a fictional book. But in historical narrative, I think it's a little off-putting. But generally, look, it's obviously finely researched, and I've always had an interest in Russia. Have I learned more from being involved in it or reading it? Yes, I have. So yeah, a 7 out of 10. I think. It's a good
that's
score.
good. That's good. So you definitely recommend it. So what's the next book you're reading?
I'm going to read a book about how this is an age of extremism with terrorism and religion and different things. So I'm sure we'll talk about that again as well in another podcast.
All really current stuff in El Arpa.
Exactly. Keeping ahead of the curve.
Is there anything else you would like to add?
Hello, Mammy. No, I think we're ready for part 3. So bring on that musical interlude. Welcome back to part 3 of the show. Whew, all that intellectual heavy lifting has left me exhausted. How was it for you?
Very tiring as well.
Yeah, it is difficult being this intellectual, isn't it?
Yes, I just, I'm exhausted from everything I've learned from you.
Well, I'm going to try and forget everything we've learned today because it's giving me a headache. But we'll be back, won't we, for the next installment, exciting episode of the Arpa podcast. So please, dear listeners, tune in. So Enda, the Russian expert, saying bye-bye.
Maria saying bye.
Maria, the Grand Inquisitor, saying bye-bye. You're listening to Subsound Radio. We bring you streaming and live broadcasting from the capital. This is the Arpa podcast.